Well, good morning and welcome to this podcast. It's called Optimal Content Delivery Strategies for Concurrent, Remote, and In-Class Students. So that's kind of a mouthful. Um, and my name is John Heffernan, and there's my parking space at school. And picture me with Hugman. That's a special Lego sculpture um, I received at a Lego event one time, and she was made by a famous sculptor. So what are we talking about? So the question here we hope to answer or help you with is how do you deliver your content when you're teaching some students at home? We call those remote students, and some in class or face-to-face students. All right, as many of us are facing this question as we attempt to teach during the pandemic. So a little context here, just so we're clear, and I think it gets confusing because there's a lot of different things going on. But the Massachusetts Department of Education asked districts for plans for 3 different scenarios. And I think as we talk about this, it's important to say what we're talking about in each one. So remote, so all the students are at home. Okay, so that's the way we did it last spring, right? And hybrid, so half the class alternates in class. So you might have half in class, half at home. And the reason for hybrid is so you have adequate spacing when the students are in class. And then all in class model, so all your students are back in school, kind of like we used to do it. However, at least in Massachusetts, the Department of Education required remote option for parents. So even if the school is going to an all in class mode, parents can still opt for their particular student to be at home for whatever health or whatever reasons they have. Now, in terms of distance learning, again, just to get our terminology straight, is you can have synchronous and asynchronous distance learning, and that can be mixed too. But in the synchronous model, all the students are there, or learners are there at the same time. All right, so that typically is with Zoom or Google Meets, etc., tools like that. Or you can have asynchronous learning, so the learners or students choose the time to access the content. Asynchronous has 2 modes, scheduled and unscheduled. In scheduled mode, all the students are working through them, or learners are working through the material at the same time, like within a week they have to do X, Y, and Z. And that allows for more interactions between the students. For example, you could have a discussion question, or students could comment on each other's work. And then you can have unscheduled asynchronous, which everyone goes at their own pace. And that kind of, the interactions between students aren't really there. So that's, but can be useful too if an individual wants to learn something on their own. So districts are going for significant synchronous time this school year, those that are in a hybrid or remote, okay? And that's a little different than the spring. We tended to be more asynchronous learning with maybe teachers would have meetings sometimes. I mean, that might depend on the grade level too, but that's what I saw in middle and high school. Most districts are starting with remote this year, or at least starting with it. Many are going to hybrid at some point in the year. Okay, some have committed to remote all year, so it really varies by district. All right, so what are we talking about today is this issue of concurrent teaching. So, and this only applies to the synchronous case. Okay, so with the asynchronous case, students can access the content at any time. And you're not necessarily involved directly at the time they are. Okay, you're checking their work later. So for the synchronous approach, again, that's when all the students are there at the same time. Some students could be in class and some could be in remote. So that's what we're getting at today. How do you deal with the technology and the presentation of content in that case? That can occur in the remote case. And so that may seem counterintuitive, but for example, in our school, we have a few kids are in school during that time. We have these special populations that are in school. Could be students with IEPs or students that had trouble with distance or remote learning. Could be kids with no internet at home. All right, so we're going to have a few kids in school, even when we're in the remote case. And hybrid, you can have, again, typically we have these two cohorts with half in class. But again, remember that parents can choose remote. So even you could have a few remote students in that case, even though you're teaching your in-class cohort. Another way to do hybrid would be to teach the in-class and remote cohort at the same time. Kind of not recommending that because it gets a little complicated, and you might want to consider doing a flipped classroom. So kids would come in and work with the content you presented asynchronously the day before. Another way to do it is the cohort that's not in school, your remote cohort, is working on some asynchronous material, and then you're teaching your in-class, kind of alternating days. So this concurrent teaching does not apply to the all in-class case, okay? In that case, why have synchronous meetings? I would not recommend it, all right? It gets into a lot of issues, and students really want your face-to-face time. I think there's a real need and desire for that. And also in the all remote case, it's not really an issue, right? Everyone's on their own device in different places. So this, again, does not apply. And there are some additional considerations is how do you do grouping, either whole class, one-to-one, or subgroups, okay? And that's within the cohort. If you're teaching hybrid, you might still want to do additional grouping within that cohort. All right, so now that we have the background here and the terminology, question is what's the best way to deliver content in this synchronous distance learning with concurrent, remote, and in-class students? So now hopefully that question makes sense. All right, and what I think of the goals as these. So I want to maximize student engagement, okay? I want to maximize face-to-face contacts, all right? So students have been at home in the spring. They were working largely on their own, asynchronously. And then even at the beginning of this year, a lot of kids are starting remote. So when kids get back to school, typically in a hybrid model, but it could be an all in-class model with some remote, we want to maximize that face-to-face contact, right? That's what we're trying to get back to. And of course, we want it to be easy for teachers and students to manage technology, and we want to eliminate audio feedback issues, which come up when you're in these situations of concurrent teaching. And we'll get into that more later, and we want to allow for different grouping options too. All right, so hopefully that's clear, and hopefully you agree with those goals. Just some background on our school. We're starting remote for a little while, a couple weeks, and then, but however, as I mentioned before, some special populations could be at school with a small number of students. And we're not 100% sure if they'll be in the classroom or in other classrooms or in the library, etc. But there'll be some kids possibly face-to-face in the classroom, but a small number. So most kids are remote, but there could be a small number of kids in our classrooms. And then we're going to go hybrid with, again, as I mentioned before, the two cohorts with alternating days. We're happen to be doing double blocks. Half the blocks on one day, then half the blocks on the other day, and asynchronous work on Fridays. And in terms of technology, we happen to use Google Classroom for our learning management system, but I believe the ideas in this podcast apply to any learning management system and any meeting technology, whether it be Zoom or Google Meets, which we use, or Schoology has its own meeting technology as well. And we have a mix of AV projection methods and hardware, so they could be wired via PC laptop, could be Wi-Fi. We happen to use Airtame. And a lot of the complication arises from, when you're in concurrent teaching and you're trying to use your AV equipment too. And that's where some of the complexity lies. All our students have Chromebooks. They could access with different devices at home potentially. Teachers typically have laptops, or desktops, but all teachers now, at least at our middle and high school, have laptops. It could be PC, could be Mac, could be Chromebooks. We're going to allow for iPads, although that's a smaller use for a teacher presenting, but all this should apply there too. All right, so I think this is kind of a key idea here is that there's basically two different models for concurrent delivery. Okay, so what they are, as if all remote. So if you look at that picture, remember the F's mean face to face. So you have, in this case, we have 3 face-to-face students in front of us and 6 remote students. However, in this model, we're treating all those students as if they were remote, all right? And we'll see, dive into that a little later. The other model is we're treating as if everyone's in front of us. So you can see on the right-hand side, you have your, in this case, 6 face-to-face students, and they're actually sitting in front of us. We have a smaller number of remote students. However, we're going to treat them basically as if they were in the classroom. They're just kind of like a little farther away. And with technology, we're going to add them to our face-to-face teaching, if you will. Okay? So let's take a look at each one. Let's look at the all remote content delivery model. And after I really considered this for a long time, I believe it makes sense. If the majority of the kids are actually remote, that it's going to be best to use this as if all remote model. And so what does it look like? All your students are in your Google Meet. Okay, so everyone joins your Google Meet. And you could marry your AV projection, so if you want to, but it wouldn't be required, again, because each kid has their own device in front of them and they're all getting the same picture. Okay, they can also have a second Chrome tab open. That could be to like a interactive Google slide or some other shared document or whatever else you choose. And the teacher, of course, students can do this too, can present their screen as desired. Okay, or could just have talking head meetings like we frequently do in Zoom or Meets. All right, of course, if you want, that's under your control if you want students to present their screen or not. That would be typically under your direction. All right, so in this case, can have a lot of audio feedback issues. So how do you avoid or reduce those? And again, just to remind you, we have most of our kids are remote. Of course, they're not going to have the feedback issues, but the kids in front of you could. So those in-class students could use headphones. That's one way to deal with it, okay? Or another way to do it is you can have the teacher sound. So the teacher could use external speakers, for example, or there could be a sound system in the room, and the rest of the class, the kids in front of you have turned the sound output off on their devices. All right, so that's another way to do it. Feedback results when the sound goes into the microphone and keeps going around in a loop, and every time it amplifies. And in any case, all but the speaker should be muted. All right, and that's kind of a general recommendation for this situation. Another thing that helps with feedback in general is to put the teacher microphone behind your speakers. Okay, so that way the speakers don't feed back into the microphone. All right, so feedback can be reduced with these methods, but probably will be an issue you'll have to deal with. You can use a doc cam as well, presented to everyone in this case. Okay, that would be typically connected to the teacher laptop. All right, so let's look at the pros and cons of that. So it's, I would say, easier to manage. Everyone has the same setup, okay? And it's familiar to us from it's typically how we do Zoom meetings or Google Meets. What are the cons? Well, I mentioned the audio issues are going to be something you have to deal with. Also, I think kids are kind of overloaded right now with technology, between their video gaming they've been doing, and generally speaking at home, and the spring with remote learning. Um, I think we want to kind of have times where we can get back to our face-to-face contact as much as possible. And think about this too, like if you have your kids coming in and they're sitting with a headphone and their own microphone, they're just sitting in the same space. Well, I would ask as a parent or a kid, I might as well be at home. It's safer, right? So, I'm there to get my face-to-face contact. I think that's the advantage of going back into the physical school space. Another thing is everyone's tethered to their devices, generally speaking, unless you have some kind of special setup. Okay, and then grouping is challenging, especially with Google Meets right now. Supposedly Google's going to make that easier, but your grouping is going to be challenging in that case. All right, what about this as if all in class content delivery model? And I believe this makes the most sense if the majority of kids are in class. This is going to work better, and we'll talk about why, the pros and cons in a minute. But the way it works is only your remote students, of course, and the teacher are in your Google Meet. Okay, the kids in front of you are not in the Google Meet. Okay, they don't need to be because they are looking at your mirrored AV projection. Okay, and that's sound and video. And they can still have, if you're doing it like a shared document, for example, they could still have their device open to whatever you want in Google Classroom or whatever platform you're using. All right, but they're not in the Google Meet. All right, the teacher or students under your control can still present their screen if that's what you want to do. And then, of course, the Google Meet, the remote kids will see that, okay, because they're in the meeting and the teachers click present in Google Meets. And the in-class students would also see it right on the whiteboard or a screen or whatever you have. All right, because you're projecting through your AV system, whatever it is, either wired or Wi-Fi projection, whatever you have. Okay, so what happens if a remote student wants to ask a question or whatever? The teacher can switch to the Meet, project that on the screen. All right, so that remote students become more part of the class and class students could see and hear them. This minimizes audio feedback issues, all right, because the kids in the class are not in your Meet, so that's going to eliminate, I'd say, 95% of your feedback issues right there. You would have the teacher sound could be on your external speakers, and typically that's going to be, when other students are speaking is the best time for that. And yep, everyone's muted again at home, except for the speaker. That just reduces general background noise. I don't think that's going to affect your feedback too much. But in general, it's a good idea to put your speaker microphone behind any external speakers, right? That will reduce, if you have feedback issues, you can do that. And again, the doc cam can be used as needed, and that's presented to the remote students on the teacher's computer and of course projected to the in-class students. Advantages of that is you're, again, as I mentioned, maximizing your face-to-face time. Okay, so your in-class students are getting a little bit tech break. Of course, you can still use a shared document or something. They still could be doing some tech, but they don't have to be. They could be pencil and paper. They could be listening to you live, face-to-face, which I think is going to be welcome. And then again, as I mentioned, it has minimal audio feedback issues or none. And grouping can be done with social distancing as you usually do in class. The remote students could either be their own group or you could, would probably be the easiest way to do that. Cons is, well, people aren't as familiar with this, and teachers especially, so might be a little bit new. And what about a couple special cases here? Again, if everyone's in class, don't even need Google Meet, okay? So you'll avoid all those issues with audio, etc. And again, well, there's no need for it really, but it's going to maximize that face-to-face feeling. If you have a self-paced or hands-on activities, how do you deal with that case? Um, and I would check in with your remote students one-to-one. They could either, you have to be listening for them to have a question, and they can present their screen to you if it's something like programming, or even using their camera. They could either talk to you or show you something with their camera. All right, so I hope this was helpful, and yeah, good luck with your concurrent teaching. So just a last slide as some recommendations. Just to summarize, use the as if all remote, for remote, and remote with special populations. So if most of the kids are remote, okay, that's the way you'd go. But use your as if all in class when we go hybrid. This is for our district, or when you're all in class with a few remote kids, choosing that. Okay. All right. Again, good luck and have fun with your new way of teaching here.